Hello everyone, welcome to today's talk. My name is Tara Kapoor. I'm in grade 10 at Head Start Educational Academy. My brother Shiv and I saw this lockdown as an opportunity to help us all by bringing professionals from various domains to expose our students to a spectrum of careers. Today, we would like to invite Mr. Pramod Chakravarthy, the CEO and founder of MedKarya. He has over 25 years of experience in the medical device and biopharmaceutical industries, primarily focusing on the development and commercialization of devices and medicines. In the 90s, he helped develop orthopedic bone cements for a startup and later worked with Pfizer, where he helped with the developing and commercialization of some of the most successful therapies in the industry. He has a BE in chemical engineering and from Pilani, an MS in chemical engineering from Ohio University, and an MBA in finance from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Before we let Mr. Chakravarthy take over, we would like to share a couple of housekeeping rules with you all. Firstly, as moderators, we will ensure everyone except the speaker is muted throughout the call. Please don't try to unmute yourself. Secondly, kindly keep your video switched off during the entire session, as this will be recorded and on YouTube. And thirdly, you may ask any questions you have at any time during the session in the chat box. Second half of this call will be used to answer the questions you have asked. As moderators, we will pose your questions directly on this. Thank you. Mr. Pramod, here.
Can everyone see me at this point?
Yeah, we can see you.
Great. Thank you, Tara. Thank you for the introduction. First off, I wanted to say I'm happy to do this. I'm glad that there's enough of an audience interested in this early enough. Just speaking from personal experience, I know that I didn't have this sort of exposure early enough to be able to make decisions about career or direction in life. And I came upon what I love to do purely by accident. So I think what you are doing, Tara and Shiv and Rajiv, is really valuable, I think, for a huge number of kids. I don't want to spend too much time on me, but let's see. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
All right, cool. So here's the plan that I want to go through a little bit of my journey, more to be instructive than anything else, hopefully very short, and then a bit of a primer about the industry, whether it's pharmaceuticals or it's medical devices. I think the journey for a product or a medicine is different. So a little bit of grounding there. I know some of you probably already know this, maybe some of you don't. So this way, everyone has the same kind of grounding and same kind of experience in terms of the rest of the conversation. Then I want to get into a little bit of what people do to get there. Like what are their career profiles? What are they doing in school? How are they getting to be what they do? And then what might help you if you're interested in this field to do in high school or even in college, whether it's in courses or it's in internships and so on, to jump into the industry, and then a little bit of what happens at the end, like once you're in the industry, what are the factors that will make you successful over the long term? Um, and please feel free to pop in the questions. I know I got a couple of questions already in the chat. The more the better. And I'm not sure that we'll get through all the questions, but depending on how many people we have. But I think this is the time to ask the questions and understand what the industry is like. And this is not just for my talk, for any talk. I think you should keep asking a lot of questions so that you know as much as you know to make the right decisions at the point of 10th grade or 12th grade or even in college. All right, so let me jump in with my journey. I was born in Bangalore, brought up in the north for many years. I was in Rajasthan, I was in Delhi, I was in Madhya Pradesh for a while. And then when I came back to Bangalore, I couldn't speak English in fifth grade, in first grade. So when I was 5 or 6 years old, I had to kind of learn English from start because I just grown up in the north and in very rural places. But I went through school, graduated for those of you that are in Bangalore, Bishop Cotton's in 12th. Then I went to BITS Pilani, Rajiv Kapoor and I were at school there together. Then I came back to Bangalore to work for a bit, went to the US, did my undergrad in chemical engineering, did my grad school in chemical engineering. Then I had a complete accident because I worked on the International Space Station. I was a materials science engineer. I was a chemical engineer, but materials science really. And by complete accident, after I graduated, what I was doing for my thesis and all my work with the International Space Station was something that a couple of scientists, one in MIT and one in Harvard, were trying to use to deal with medical or orthopedic implants. So that's how, back in the day, you didn't have the internet. So I saw an ad in the paper and it looked like totally fit for my background. And it turned out to be a medical device company. So I loved it. I was number 7 in the company. I had a great experience. I did so many different things over the 5-6 years I was there that I decided I need to go to business school. And my boss was a founder, who was a professor at Harvard, said, "You're being an idiot. You should go and do a PhD instead. You choose the PhD you want to do in Harvard, and I'll make sure you get it." But I was pretty certain I wanted to move to the business side. So I left. I went to business school. That I wanted to do. I was passionate about healthcare already, and I believed that I needed to see the other end of the spectrum. So a small company, medical device. So I went to large company, pharmaceuticals. And for the most part, last 15 years, last 18 years, I've been focused on pharmaceuticals and the services that relate to pharmaceuticals or medical devices. So that's my journey. I myself have 3 kids, 3 boys. They are 17, 14, and 10. So I have at least 2 of them in the same boat that many of you are in right now. And so that's one of the reasons why this is an important experience. All right, so let's get into the typical journey of a medicine. And I apologize to anyone who already knows the story, but I think it's worthwhile grounding ourselves into it, because where you go in your career is sort of going to be driven by this journey. And we'll do the same thing for devices. So for the typical medicine, and I don't care if it's a pill or it's an injectable. So I'm calling it biopharma because biotech and pharmaceuticals used to be called two different things. But almost all companies these days, all organizations are a blend of the two. So whether you're making a pill or you're making a shot, it's topical now with vaccines and treatment for COVID and everything else. You always start with a model. So if you're a computer scientist or you're a computer engineer, this is a place that is the most core because you're trying to model everything before you get into the rest of the process. It's going to take $1 billion, maybe $2 billion, sometimes more, to bring a medicine to market. So you want to do as much as you can upfront to decide what will not work. So that, in the past, you didn't have this option because you didn't have the computation. You didn't have the ability to code and to create algorithms to check whether your medicine would actually work. So you start with something on a computer. If you think there are good targets, you might have about 5,000 of them. You pick a disease, you pick a problem that you need to solve. You might come out with 5,000, 10,000 potential targets. Then you go into the lab and say, can I synthesize them? If a particular molecule can be synthesized, can I actually do it in the lab and I can see if it works or not? And some of you might have seen news that said, okay, there's a company in California that was able to show that 8 patients kind of produced antibodies. But the reason is they took healthy patients, they gave them a medicine, they put it into the test tube to see if it actually killed or dealt with the COVID virus. So that's the in vitro part. Now, let's leave COVID aside or vaccines aside for the moment, but a typical medicine will also go through testing in animals. And depending on the medicine, it might be in rats, in pigs, in cows, in primates, many times. So once you have all of that done and you're comfortable enough that it's safe, number one, and efficacious, meaning it's doing its job, then you go into humans. And this is a tricky part because you need to go to your regulator, whether it's the FDA in the US or the EMEA authorities or the Japanese authorities or MDA, whatever it is. You go to a regulator and say, can I start throwing this into completely healthy people? So I might pick somebody in their 20s or 30s that's completely healthy and then give them a medicine that's entirely untested. So it's a small number of people and you're only looking to see if it's safe. And as you're doing that, you're trying to prepare manufacturing for a larger set of clinical trials. And let's say that works out well. And the regulator says, okay, I'm comfortable that you're safe. Go into proving efficacy, but with a small number of people. So then I will pick a small, I'm saying 100 to 500, depends on the disease. And some in rare diseases where you may have 500 people in the entire country, it may be 25 people, I don't know, or oncology for that matter. But then you say, here I'm looking for both safety and efficacy with people who have been diagnosed. So I'm trying to cure the disease and also check for safety at the same time. If that works out, you have to get the regulator's approval to get to the next stage, which again, for a rare disease or an oncology product might be small populations. If it's cardiovascular, like if you're testing a blood pressure, cholesterol medicine, it's going to be 10,000 people, 15,000 people. And it has to be global. So more and more countries are insisting that you have to have enough of their populations tested before they will let you sell a product in that country. So you get to that global clinical trial stage. That's the most expensive stage. So think of this as also cost-wise least expensive on the computer, a little bit more in the lab, definitely expensive at the preclinical stage, much more expensive in phase 1, even more in phase 2, and the balloon is phase 3. And all through, you have a whole bunch of people, which I'll get into, a whole bunch of career profiles that I'll get into later, that are helping to make this happen. So let's say you get through phase 3, your product is good, and it doesn't always work out. So if you start with, let's say, 10, 15,000 people, targets early on, you probably have about 2 or 3 by phase 3. So constantly molecules are getting knocked out, or injectables are getting knocked out through the entire process before they end up at phase 3. And then even at phase 3, Pfizer had a product that I think we spent close to $1 billion on, 850 million. And in phase 3, the trial had to be stopped because once you tested it at that point, phase 2 was not even 500, it was maybe 5,000. It was great. Once you tested it in 15,000 people, you started to see complications. That was safety. You didn't see it anywhere previously. So after $850 million of investment in phase 3, that product was killed. So it's a very risky process. But then once you're at the end, you start with the commercialization. So you take a product, and that first pill costs $1 billion. But every second shot or pill costs you very little money to make, because you're doing that throughout the process. You're preparing for manufacturing, you're preparing everything else. So beyond that point, you're making a lot of money, which is what pharma is always criticized for, but you're paying off what you spent over the previous 6 stages. So you've got a lot of activity also in commercialization. That's when you see the ads on TV in the US and in New Zealand, I think. Nowhere else, I think ads alone. But you see a lot of commercial activity. You see a lot of need for economics. So you have to go and tell somebody. You have to, in the US, you have to tell insurers, here's your insured population, here's the burden of their disease to you in terms of cost. And here's how a medicine will lower that. So if you take a hepatitis drug, you'll spend $80,000 a year, $60,000 a year or whatever, but you won't have to spend $200,000 to $300,000 on a liver transplant. Because once you spend that $84,000, you're set. You don't have to treat the patient anymore, no more medicine, no transplant. So you have to assess the burden of disease for each country, each state, each insurer, private insurer, and accordingly sell. And then you have to say, okay, if it's a cardiovascular product, if it's a nephrology product, how do I sell to those people? So you have to have a commercial strategy that is focused on each area, each product, each demographic, and the burden of disease for that market. I've got lots of examples about how, there are certain diseases and conditions that occur only in certain countries or certain types of demographics, like only kids that are have a particular gene in them. So you have to be very careful about market segmentation and where you put your sales money. You have to worry about price. So something that was the really great renal cancer product in the US, which I worked on, was about $35,000 in the US, $1,500 in India, still on patent. So every country is able to afford what it can afford, and you have to figure out how to handle that. And regulatory processes. So you have to make sure that regulatory requirements are being met in each country. So that's another huge effort for anything that is in commercialization. I just put phase 4 there because some products, even though they're approved and you think they're done, doctors will come back and tell you, hey, I just used it in some other particular indication, seems to work really well. So I used growth hormone in a patient to do what you have a label for, what you're approved for, but it works for something else. So I used it, and I think we should do something about it. So then we might run a phase 4 clinical trial, a trial that basically is looking at whether the drug can work on other indications, the ones that may not have been thought about all the way in the beginning. And then there's lots of exclusivity. Now there's, India used to be the largest company in this department, right? So a product goes off patent. So whether it's Lupin or it's Ranbaxy or it's Dr. Reddy's Labs or Sun Pharmaceuticals now, all of these guys used to be on top of the hill in terms of taking over a product that went off patent. That was a pill. Now, a lot of that moved to China because we had quality issues, we had all kinds of complications, but there's an opportunity, I think, now for India to come back to being a leader in that space. It's still one of the largest, it's basically India, China, and Israel, I think, that are leaders. The US has some companies, but I think they make most of their stuff elsewhere as well. It's taking a pill that used to be $10, let's say, and making it 50 cents. So your margin may be about 5 cents, 10 cents. So you're shrinking down your margin, but you're selling a lot. So most countries have about 70 to 80% of their medicines, India included, that are generic. So these are not patent, they're off patent, they can be made by anybody, and they're low margin. The complication now are injectables. So if you work on a product that is an injectable, this whole process applies to anyone who's doing the copy at the end, once you lose a patent. So if I'm Biocon in India, and I want to copy something that was made by AbbVie or someone in the US, I have to do clinical trials. So suddenly my cost of entry, my ease of coming into the business just goes so high that there are not many people coming in there. So you have a lot of US companies or European companies or Japanese companies, now Chinese companies, that are jumping in to make biosimilars, copying existing injectables. And it's not a simple process. It's not going to be $2 billion. It may be about a few $100 million. But you can command a larger price. And there's a bigger margin there. So that is kind of the range. And please feel free to keep shooting questions as we talk through this. Now let me get to devices, much simpler. You will do something in the lab, right? In the lab, I mean, maybe you're trying to, and I've done this in the past, maybe try to break some bones and see if you can, cement them or whatever it is, right? You're trying to throw an implant that you make into an animal hip, whatever it is. So you do some of the lab work. You also do a lot of work on the computer to kind of model and see how does a person walk, how does a knee replacement look like. You're putting a new cap on the knee. You're putting a new screw in the hip, whatever that might be. So you have to do some design work. You have to decide your pathway, because depending on your class of medical device, you can essentially go straight from stage 1 through to commercial in as little as 3 to 6 months. If you have to go through clinical trials, like the products I worked on were always going through clinical trials. You have to go through the same process of checking with animals. And again, depending on the particular device you're making, there's a different model that you have to follow. You have to figure out the animal model, and you have to do the surgery, implant, see what happens, etc. One difference here is diagnostics. So if I have a diagnostic, that's happening now, right, with COVID. If I have a diagnostic, I can go from the lab, basically taking, let's say, antibodies, testing against the patient, or testing against cells that are viral, and then going straight into commercial, because I'm making a diagnostic kit. If I'm making a thermometer, I can take a thermometer, make sure I test it. I can go straight to not quite clinical trials, but a kind of a study and say, like, I tested it against 50 different temperatures 1,000 times, and they've been correct. So you go straight to commercial. But if you have a product that's injectable, that is maybe going into the body in any fashion, you have to go through this process of preclinical and clinical, just like pharma. But it's condensed. You just do very short trials. Now, this is a very quick process to get to approval. However, the problem with devices is that somebody else will figure it out. And if you have a patent, you have 5 patents, doesn't matter. I have patents that, of course, now they're dead. But the likelihood that somebody else will come along and write a patent that is slightly different and supersedes it, or hang on one second. All right, kids are out for lunch. So the likelihood that somebody else is going to come along and make another device that is similar is very high. So you can think of stents as an example. So stents are a situation where everybody thought it was the greatest thing in the world, and the company that came out with the first stent got nothing more than maybe 3 years before another company came out and did it. Third company came out 1 year later. And before you knew it, stents had basically an 18-month timeline to make your money. Otherwise, after that, there's a zillion stents out of the market. So you have to be very careful. Diagnostics is an interesting space because you need to know biochemistry a lot, but at the end of it, or physics for that matter, if you're doing thermometers and things like that, you have to have the user experience nailed down. So there are a zillion products that you'll see in the pharmacy that come in that are very clever, but they're not user-friendly. It's almost like a website. So if you don't design them well, and you don't design them with the viewers, with the patient's perspective or a parent's perspective. It's a thermometer for kids, for example. That product is going to go away soon. Somebody else will come in and say, you can't get a baby to do this. You can't get a baby to do that, whatever it is. So, you have to diagnose differently. So I think there is a lot of user experience component to the diagnostics and devices that are off the shelf, and the inside body stuff is still going through a clinical trial process, and you're going to be down under, they're going to be put anesthesia on you, and you have no option of choosing what you want or what you get. All right, so functions that are part of the business. And this is true, I think, more for pharma, to an extent for device, depending on what your product is. So any degree in science, anything that you're doing in terms of biology or chemistry or computers, right, is a very valuable thing in the early stages. You always need someone who knows math, and math will pervade the rest of the fields. I mean, in the sense of pharmacology and epidemiology is all math. So you need a statistician to come up with the right models to be able to tell a regulator, look, it's safe enough to go to the next stage. You need a statistician to say, it's in the market, someone's complaining that it's not safe or it's not efficacious. Or you need to tell a government that, look, it's worth your money. And the person that's going to come up with the numbers is a statistician. A pharmacologist will decide your dosage. So that's kind of chemistry mostly, but somewhat biology, somewhat math. Trying to see, okay, should I give somebody 10 milligrams, 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams? What's safe? What's the minimum level of efficacy? And so on and so forth. Then you've got the epidemiologist, and this comes back to a question I think I saw before the meet started. But these are the guys who are going to figure out, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Are we trying to cure a disease that no one has? What is the burden of that disease? How many people have it? What is the cost of treating that disease? What is the cost of not treating that disease? That's what epidemiologists do early on, and later on, they combine with pricing people to say, okay, how do you negotiate with somebody, whether it's a government, whether it's an entity that's a private insurance company? How do you convince them with facts and numbers that treating them with a device or a drug is valuable, and it's saving them money, making them money, maybe if it's a private company? But how do you make that happen? Doctors, huge component throughout pharma and biotech. So one caution here, because we did listen to the webcast last week. One cautionary note here is that you will not be a physician and jump into pharma or device at entry level. Most physicians in the industry, in either industry, are folks who have worked for a while as practicing physicians, or they've been academic physicians who also practiced, of course, in academic medical centers. Typically, it's the latter. So they have a reputation for being really sound, and they're the ones in the early stages that are designing the clinical trials or helping design the clinical trials. They're helping to design the labels. They're dealing with the regulators, because if you go to the FDA or the EMA or the MDA, whatever it is, any of these authorities will talk to a doctor. You know, someone like me shows up, it's not a doctor. They're like, let me talk to a doctor. Let me talk to a nephrologist. If it's a nephrology product, let me talk to an oncologist who focuses on on breast cancer if that's what we're doing. So a physician is a hugely valuable profession in the industry, but it's not something you get into right out of college. You have to go work for a while somewhere else, and then you move into industry. Now, there's another slide on this as well, but none of this works without a bunch of enabling functions. So finance, project management, supply chain, manufacturing, and technology. I think I already mentioned technology, but once you get into commercial, you also add to it econ, right? So pricing is basically economics, in a sense. There's more sophistication in terms of what education you have later on, but it's basically economics to figure out demand, supply, and where you can price. And communications and public relations, because this is one of those areas where you have to really communicate to physicians, because there's 5,000 products coming out at any point of time. There's no time that they have as a practicing physician to understand what's out there, what's new, why is it new, why is it better, why can't I use warfarin? You shouldn't use warfarin because you have a bigger chance of bleeding. Use the new stuff, Eliquis, 2 other things, Praluent. Use one of the new ones because you have a less likelihood of bleeding. But a physician doesn't always have time to look at everything. So how you communicate to the physician is one big thing. How you communicate to the public is another different thing. How you communicate to governments and to payers and so on is a third thing. So the list is long. It's not exhaustive. There are many, many more profiles that you will typically see in any industry leader in either pharma or device. But this is just to give you an idea. So again, this is a more detailed one, which just talks about how your general functions affect the industry. You could be a legal person, extremely important. You don't, in the US, you can't put an ad out, you can't put any kind of commercial communication out without legal, talking to the FDA and FDA saying, yes, you can do it legally. So it's a complicated process. It's a very regulated process. I would argue that this is probably regulated more than any other industry in Europe, Japan, US, and any developed market, Korea too, Korea and Australia as well. So obviously money is very important. It's mostly private, even though everyone says it's all government money that funds this. It's really government money that spends $10 million and the rest of the 1.9 billion is spent by private industry. So raising money, managing money, it's and dealing with the construction of plants and supply chain is another huge thing. So finance is an extremely important component. As I mentioned, communications and policy. So a lot of the time, people are out there in Washington, D.C., in Delhi, so on and so forth, just trying to tell governments that don't know diddly squat why they should support one thing or the other. Why you can actually give polio medicine to kids in Pakistan or Afghanistan when the government would have said, no, I don't want it. It's coming from the US. So communications and policy is a big deal anywhere in the world, more so in the West probably because that drives funding decisions, but also in developing countries. Supply chain is extremely important, as I mentioned earlier. And we underestimate all these things, but if you know how to manage a lab, you know how to manage how to buy things, if you like to shop. These are very important things because this is a consumption heavy industry, whether it's clinical trials, whether it's hiring CROs to run these multi-million, multi-$100 million studies. You need people who are really good at it and who can get good at it. Okay, so my last slide. And I think I overshot by about 10 minutes. Any field is useful in the industry. But what is more important is a passion for the industry. So the reason I got into this in the first place was by accident. I saw an ad in the paper. I thought it was for a semiconductor business. And then once I started working, I saw a mission. I saw the fact that the orthopedic medical device that we were creating was going to help people. And you have to have that sense of mission because you will not become wealthy quickly. You won't start up a company and go public. Well, I don't know if anyone can do that anymore in this current climate, but you will not start up a company and become wildly wealthy in 5 years. So this is not one of those short-term plays. You have to take your time. You have to become an expert at something. You have to become an expert at some segment of this value chain. And you have to be, you have to build a reputation for being good at it. And that's what's going to take you forward. What do you need in terms of a degree? Biology, chemistry, pharmacology, all of these, the list is huge. And you don't have to end there. See, my own example, I started with engineering, ended up in pharma. So you can go in any direction, but an important component is how you manage people and how you manage projects. So how you're managing your own work today, and if it's not good, maybe think about that. And that is probably the last line item that I think is maybe valuable for any industry you're in. Learn how to manage projects and solve problems, and learn how to manage people. Learn how to be social, learn how to be harsh when you need to be, but kind most of the time. What can you do to be successful, like out the door after college? If you can, if you're in high school and you can take advanced classes in high school, some of the kids here can do that. My kids are not interested in this field, so they're not doing it, but they could. You can take advanced classes in high school. And in undergrad, by the time you're in your third year, maybe even sooner, what you've done in high school, start to take advanced classes that are focused. If you're a mechanical engineer and you're interested in biomechanical engineering, in implants and things like that, jump into those bio classes, jump into biomechanics classes. That'll make a good college experience for you, and you can just walk into a job after college with that experience. In between, find internships and look, be adventurous here. Try something that you think you're passionate about at the end of first year. If it doesn't work, you don't like it, fine, forget it. You're never going back to that again. Like you don't like pharmaceuticals, fine, give it up. You don't have to go back to it. Or maybe you don't like that company. Maybe you want to try it again in a different company. So feel free to just try a bunch of different things. And you can always quit any of them. You can always focus on them. You love the first year. You go back to the same place the second year. You have a guaranteed job for sure. And then use your parents. Use your parents and their friends, their families, your friends and your friends' families. So at the end of the day, I think your network matters more than anything else. All right, I'll stop. I'm already 17 minutes too late. Shall we jump into the questions, Farah?
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions already. So I think we can get into them. So the first question is, for our generation, what are some of the top things that we should look to change to make pharma more effective?
What are the top things we should do to make pharma more effective?
Top two, three things to change to make pharma more effective.
I don't know if you guys have to do anything different. I mean, it's a constant process of evolution, right? I mean, when we came into the industry 25 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever it was, science was different, computing was different. So the approaches were different. So, as an example, today, I was in a conversation a couple of days ago around how you run clinical trials. So, typically, clinical trials, you go, you sign up for a clinical trial, you sign a bunch of forms, and then you have to go to the doctor and report what happened to you. So, if you're taking a pain medication, you have to go back once in a month, maybe once in 2 weeks, and you have to say, here's my log. I had the pain on a scale of 1 to 10. On Monday, it was 3. On Tuesday, it was 5, whatever it is. And of course, I don't know if I'm getting a sugar pill or I'm getting the actual medicine, but I'm in clinical trial. So that is exceedingly cumbersome because most of the time, that person is filling out 2 weeks worth the day of showing up at the doctor's office. Right? So there's no reliability. So now you go into medical, reporting through your phone. So if you have an app, and that's a device, that's a medical device, an app will basically take your measurement. It'll remind you, it'll say, time to tell me, it's morning of Monday, it's afternoon of Thursday. So you have to tell me what that pain reading is. So I think knowledge of technology is very valuable in general, across the board, whether you're a physician, whether you're a scientist, whatever it is, but that may be forced on you anyway. So that's where I'm going. I don't think you need to change anything. I think you just need to be very, very cognizant of the impact of technology on a patient than on the process of care. The other thing I would say, anything that you can do differently, I think I would think of what can be done through regulation. And not that it's something that you can influence directly, but you have to force your governments, wherever you are, whether it's India or US, we have to force governments to be realistic about regulation, because that is the biggest cost in the industry. It's also good if you're a lawyer or a finance person or a regulatory person. Go ahead, Tara.
So our next question is, what do you feel about a dual degree with economics and biotech?
Oh, I think I mentioned that earlier, right? I mean, the value of econ comes into when you're trying to decide.
Could you just go a little more into detail?
Yeah, of course. So biotech basically gives you your grounding into the manufacture of medicine, right? How you make a medicine or how you commercialize a medicine. So you have to figure out how you're going to price it. First of all, how you're going to make it. Do I make a medicine in a different country? Do I make the plant development happen in India, in China, in Vietnam, in some other country? So you have to decide from an economics perspective where there is value in making the medicine, if there is value in making the medicine, and also once the medicine is in market, how do I price the medicine? So an econ degree and a biotech thing are a great combination. But if you're interested in biotech or in the sciences, I wouldn't do it just for the. If you could get an econ degree and do something else. You could go into banking, finance, etc. But I would say an econ degree is a very valuable thing. And to go back to the previous question, I think figuring out the economics would actually help in reducing the cost of medicine. So for those of you that are coming in into college, maybe spending some time in your undergrad degree, doesn't matter what you're doing, take some econ classes, because I think it's going to help you in general to understand the whole financials of the industry.
Thank you. Our next question is, what are the different fields in biotechnology that one can look at?
So I think I went through the fields, but I would say essentially the you're looking at biology, chemistry, micro. So the majors in colleges these days are very, very different, right? So it's hard to say which fields, but I would say biology, microbiology, biochemistry, any of those fields are good. In the US, you take a pre-med program that covers all of them. You could go into, if you're really passionate about this, it doesn't matter, because then you can go into math. Math and computer science, to me, are other areas. And one of my cousins, actually, one of my younger cousins, was by his fourth year in Karnataka, he was working on biomechanical. He was a mechanical engineer, but he was taking classes in biomechanical. So you could take engineering, you could take math, but his biomechanical was mostly computer science, because they didn't have the opportunity to do a lot of testing and a lot of mechanics in the lab. They didn't have great labs. But he went down the silico route. So he had access to apps and to programs and so on. So he went down that route. So that to me, if you're thinking purely of the development process, I would go with the sciences, engineering, math, computer science. Now, you could end up in finance, BCom route, whatever it is, accounting, and then route back into pharma, because that's your interest.
Thank you. We have one last question for tonight. And that's, what's the difference between bioscience and biotechnology?
I think it's kind of bioscience and biotechnology. I don't know if there is a big difference. It's new. It's kind of it's words, right? Bioscience is going to be part of biotechnology. Biotechnology is part of bioscience. So bioscience, I think, in the old world was thought of more as, your reagents, your like, now we're talking about COVID testing, right? So COVID testing, you need reagents. So who makes reagents? Bioscientists. Biotechnology is that machine that does the PCR, that once you put your tissue into the reagent, you're testing it through a device. So I don't know. I mean, to me, those are just mnemonics. I mean, it doesn't matter. Bioscience, biotechnology, you have to more divide it, I think, into pharmaceuticals, as in, is it a medicine? Or is it a diagnostic or a device? Is it a thermometer? Is it an implant? Is it a stent? Is it a valve in your heart? Is it an artificial valve, artificial heart? These are devices and they're medicines. Now, whether it's bioscience, biotech, doesn't matter. I think those are minimal distinctions. I also have a bunch of questions that came to me privately. I could answer them as well. I have time. So could you please elaborate on the research involved in actually making the medicine? So this is Ananya, right? So essentially, as I mentioned, you're going from what you model in the lab to what you can do in what you're modeling in on a computer, right? You're taking your packages, you're trying to put particular viruses, virae, or bacteria, and then you're trying to see how you can deal with it, or you're dealing with tumors, and you're trying to see how you can particularly control a tumor or a tumor attacking or spreading, whatever it is. Then you're trying to go from a computer to the lab, where you're taking actual cells. And let me take the oncology example because I can run through the whole thing, or the COVID example, either one. But I can go through and pull out from a biopsy the particular cancerous cells that are multiplying like crazy. I can manufacture, synthesize the protein or whatever else I'm trying to do to deal with that, right? And I'm doing this in sequence. So in that 10,000, 15,000 targets I have, I pick out the ones that I think I can make. If I can make them, then I find the tumorous cells, and then I try to see if it works in a test tube, in the lab. If that works, then I find an animal, and depending on the particular disease, I will find the appropriate animal model, which means it's got to be done in mice. Typically, oncology is mice. So I give mice a cancer, and then I try to inject that thing that worked well in the test tube into the mouse and see if it works. I'm not one mouse, but I might hundreds. So if that works, then I try to, and that's a study in itself. A preclinical study is like a clinical trial, and you have to submit it to the FDA and say, look, I'm going to find 15 healthy people, and I'm going to give them this medicine. They have no cancer, they have nothing. I'm going to give them the medicine. So you give them the medicine, and they don't have side effects. Then it's great. That's not always the case. In fact, gene therapy 15 years ago had a huge breakdown because in UPenn, the first gene therapy trials, 2 kids died, 2 healthy college students died because whatever they gave them at that point, which worked really well in animals, didn't work in, or actually killed the humans. So you have to be careful with the whole human model. Sorry. So you have to get to the next stage. After that, if the human safety studies work out well, then you get to efficacy studies. So then you say, okay, I had 10 people, they were all okay for a period of time, which is what worries me about COVID, because everyone's like skipping the safety piece and they're like, Let's just give it to everybody and see what happens. So you see if they're safe, they're unaffected with any side effects for a period of time, and then you put that into a safety study. A safety study, you are checking to see if it's actually curing anything. In the case of oncology, you're checking for two things. You're checking for one, is there progression of survival? Meaning, if somebody was expected to die in 6 months, are they surviving for another 8 months, another 10 months, another 12 months? That's progression. And overall survival. How long do they end up living? So those studies take longer. And then if that works out in phase 2, your regulator typically says, you can go to phase 3 where you don't study 100 people, you study 1,000 people, or 5,000 people, or 50,000 people, whatever it is. For vaccines, it's typically, I know for the pediatric vaccines that most of you guys have probably got at some point or the other, it's usually 50,000 patients. That's a 10-year process. That's a 8 to 10-year process. So you go through that, and then you can tell the regulator, look, I have data with so many patients. I have data with 300 patients for oncology or 50,000 for a vaccine. Approve it. Now, in that stream, there are all these other functions. There's somebody who's going to decide, should it be 10 milligrams? Should it be a shot with 10 milliliters or 50 milliliters? And what should be the concentration? So there is a lot of kind of work that's going on in between. How should we make it? Where should we make it? What should the plant look like? How do the cell cultures work? So it's involved that way, but in broad terms, that's the process in making the medicine. So what else do I see? Vijay had a question around long process. Pharma companies' debts are high. I think pharma companies' debts are actually not high in the innovator world. So I should divide this into two worlds, right? So there's a set of companies that are making innovative medicines. So I'll make a bet on something today. I'll go through that in silico process and the whole thing I mentioned. And by the time I come out to market, it'll be 15 years from now, 10 years from now. I'll spend a couple of $1 billion. These companies are making a ton of money on their existing products that were developed 10, 15 years ago. And that is funding the expense for the products in the pipeline. So it is a long and painful process, but it is also, like I said, the first pill or the first shot is $1 billion to $2 billion. Every shot after that is fairly inexpensive. So your margin is huge. So you're making enough money once you're approved to fund everything that's happening behind. So that 10, 15 years from now, you'll have new medicines. But if you're in the generic industry, your margins are small. So whether you make a nice toy, whether you make, an iPhone or a mouse or something, you're in the same boat. So maybe the debt situation is worse for those companies, but not so much for the ones that are innovative. The innovative companies are throwing off cash like crazy. Any other questions? I'm not seeing. Vivek had a couple. Oh yeah, Vivek had the question that I think. So I think Vivek's question is actually very interesting. So given the particular time you're in, does it matter what you do differently? I don't think you do anything differently. I think you stick to you stick to your plan, you stick to your education in the sense that you do what you need to do in high school, what you can do in high school. So you don't always have the option. You do as much as you can to specialize in college. And you're talking, I don't know, for some of you, maybe it's 4 years. For some of you, it's even more, 6, 8. And at the end of it, I'm not sure it's going to be different from what it is today. And for most of you, you would probably need to do some sort of graduate work anyway. So if the job market is good in 4 years from now, let's say, no problems. If the job market is not great, go to grad school. It'll never hurt you. And then, that's then another 3 years or 2 years or 5 years or whatever it is, depending on whether you do a master's or PhD. And at the end of it, everyone gets sick. Everyone needs medicines. So one way or the other, everyone will be employed in this industry one way or the other. What kind of online courses? I'm not sure what the online courses are, but there are tons of them now, especially in the last 2-3 months. I haven't looked at them. I'd also look at periodicals. So maybe we can try and figure this out offline, Ariman, because I think there are periodicals that will give you, especially if you're interested in a combination of econ and biotech, then there are a bunch of things that I subscribe to that tell me about pricing and market sizing or stuff like that, which you can always read. Courses I have to look up. I'm not sure exactly what courses are relevant or would even make sense if you don't have the grounding in math and biotech, in bio and chemistry that you get in the initial years of college. Did I get all the questions? Please ping me if I missed anything.
We've covered all the questions that were sent on the main group.
Cool.
Okay, so I think we've come to the end of today's session. So I'd like to thank you, Mr. Pramod, and thank you all for joining us today. Before you log off, just a quick reminder that our next session is on Sunday, the 24th of May, with Mr. Rishi Vasudev, who will speak about fashion and e-commerce. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you again, Mr. Pramod. Thank you.
Thank you, Taran. Thank you, Shiv. Nice work.